All right, so I always like to begin with this particular image because it represents what I knew and what I didn't know going into this research project. So this actually comes from the New York Times. It's a sketching that accompanies an article in which the New York journalist goes undercover with rum runners operating on the river shore in Detroit. And I just love this kind of beam of light highlighting the boat that's being unloaded at the shore. And that represented growing up on Lake Erie in Newport, Michigan, Monroe County. I had always heard the swashbuckling stories of the farmers who would take the season off, and that would be what they would do as part of their employment, at least illegal employment. But then in the shadows, you have a truck. You have a driver at the wheel looking for a destination beyond for this load. And that got me thinking, how come I never heard this story? The role that the automobile had during the Prohibition years. It's something that was foreign to me. I was like, how come no one's ever researched it? So I decided to do that. I'm certainly not the first person, I won't be the last person to research and write about Prohibition. These are just a few of the books that I'd recommend if you don't have a lot of knowledge about this topic. Rum Running the Roaring Twenties was a book written by Professor Philip Mason, Wayne State University. He focuses on kind of the Detroit perspective and the rum running across the water. Kenneth Dixon's Nothing Personal, Just Business is actually a good look at the gangster culture that develops in Toledo specifically. And then finally, Marty Gervais's Rum Runner Scrapbook is like a colorful book. It captures a bunch of vignettes and stories from Canadians who were involved in rum running or in law enforcement at that time. So these are all books I would add to your collection if you're interested. But how is my book any different than all these other books that have been written, right? Well, like I said, this book really focuses on how the motor car impacts not just those responsible for enforcing the dry laws, but also those who want to break them, right? And another major difference between my book and others is, unlike the other books that take more of a localistic approach, I'm kind of taking a more wider region approach. And that's because I want to kind of think like the criminals themselves. They did not respect borders. They exploited them. And when they exploited borders in this region, it was very profitable. But before I get into like the Prohibition years, I first want to set the scene. Prior to the 1910s, most people who could afford an automobile were the wealthy or the upper middle class. Then something happens in 1913, I'm sure you're familiar with this, right? Henry Ford, the assembly line, the Model T. He starts spitting them out at efficient rates, and they become affordable to the common man, at least the middle class. And by the end of that decade, half of the cars on the roadways in America are Model Ts. But this area doesn't become known as kind of the Motor City region just because of Henry Ford and Ford. Actually, 8 of the top 10 car brands that existed in the United States at that time were in Southeast Michigan. The number 2 car brand, anyone know where? Toledo, Ohio. Willys Overland. The Willys Knights were a very successful car among the middle class. And then across the river in Canada, the number 1 car producing city, Windsor. So the epicenter of the motor car world was truly here in this region. And it has profound effects on our culture. I can name a whole slew of them. Farmers started getting rid of their horses in favor of Model Ts on the farm because of the horsepower, right? You had, here in Livonia, there are stories of thieves using cars to steal chickens, produce, and things like that from farms. The criminality kind of explodes because of the automobile. The Good Roads movement leads to paved roads throughout this area. That's why I think Michigan has the worst roads in the country, because we have some of the oldest roads. Right? But probably most importantly is employment. The motor car industry brings incredible employment to this area. John Willys Overland Company employs the most people in the Glass City in Toledo throughout the 1910s, tens of thousands of people. Henry Ford, by the end of the 1920s, is employing over 100,000 people at his factories. And in Windsor, for instance, throughout the 1910s, 40% of all males were employed in some kind of way in the automobile industry. So what this does is it ensures that our local populace is intimately familiar with the automobile. And that's going to set them up for success, at least criminal success, during the Prohibition years. And one thing to also remember is that Prohibition doesn't just come suddenly. This has been a long-term movement that really gains traction in the age of the automobile. 1870s, the Women's Christian Temperance Union really kind of brings Prohibition to the forefront. These are women who are upset with their husbands, who are basically drunkards, right? And they want these saloons to close. There was actually a chapter of the WCTU in Plymouth, actually, during this time period. But they don't really gain traction at a national, there's national speaking engagements, but they never get like the prohibition measures on the ballot. Then you have the National Prohibition Party. That begins really in the 1880s, but once again, they win no elections. The Anti-Saloon League comes along in the 1890s, 1900s. They are successful in getting some of these measures on the ballot, but once again, there's no breakthrough. It's not until the 1910s, in the age of the automobile, does Prohibition start to see success in elections. And I would argue it's because of these arguments during this motor car age. First of all, drunk driving became a major public issue in the 1910s for obvious reasons. People were being killed on the roadways, including kids. A lot of kids used to play in the streets way back when, and many, many kids were mowed down by drunk drivers. Also, you got to think about how, the $5 a day at Ford and many of these other automotive companies are starting to pay their employees much better wages. The problem is, those wages aren't coming home. Guess where they're going? They're going to the saloon. And these women are upset, and they're arguing that they can't enjoy the middle-class American lifestyle that's being promoted to them. So therefore, women are very much in favor of Prohibition. And in fact, some historians would argue that the 19th Amendment is a reward for helping pass the 18th Amendment. And then finally, and probably most importantly, is that in almost unanimous fashion, automobile tycoons were in favor of Prohibition. Henry Ford, Gordon McGregor over in Canada, who's the head of Ford Canada, John Willys, as I mentioned, in Toledo, they all want the saloon gone, and for obvious reasons. They need sober, efficient workers on their factory lines. And prior to this moment, if you look at any of Ford's primary sources over there at the Benson Research Center, he's constantly complaining about drunkards on the assembly line, people not showing up to work. So he needs a sober workforce, and so does every other automobile tycoon using the assembly line. So they want these saloons, these distilleries right outside the factory gates to be gone forever. And they bankroll a lot of the Prohibition movement. What a lot of Americans get wrong about Prohibition as well is it just doesn't come all of a sudden with the 18th Amendment in 1920. It comes in a kind of like a piecemeal fashion, a Prohibition legislation. And the first place to believe it or not to have it is Ontario. Ontario has the first Prohibition legislation in our region with the Ontario Temperance Act. And that takes effect in September 1916. And there's these colorful reports about what's going on that last day in Windsor. There were elderly women on their knees begging for beer for their husbands back home who were drunkards and not willing to go out. There were farmers from the countryside loading up the backs of their truck with as much beer as possible to survive Prohibition. When the alcoholic supply was exhausted at 7 p.m., guess what happened? They went across the river, continued partying in Detroit. And there was a lot of arrests that happened from a lot of Canadians at that point. An interesting loophole in the OTA was exploited early on during these first years. So as you probably know, it was legal to export alcohol out of Ontario at this time under the OTA. So there was a system in place initially where you could call as a Canadian resident to a Detroit exporting office. They would pick up your load for you from a local Canadian brewery right down the street and deliver it to your house. Supposedly that was exporting. Eventually they closed that. But that would remain an issue throughout the Prohibition years, especially the American Prohibition years, Canada being able to export. But just a couple months after the OTA takes effect, Michigan itself votes dry. A lot of people don't realize this. Michigan, by a 75,000 person margin, votes in favor of Prohibition before national Prohibition even begins. And that's a pretty significant margin, but you might notice on this map here, there are some dark counties forming. Those are the counties that voted against state prohibition. That's Monroe, Wayne, and Macomb counties, a corridor forming, conveniently tucked around Canada right there. But also, remember, who's also wet at this time? Ohio. Ohio's still wet. So this is going to cause problems in the early Prohibition period, as we'll see. That state prohibition measure doesn't take effect until May 1918. And what happens is Michiganders use what's called the interurban to transport alcohol. Not automobiles, not boats, but the interurban. Do we know what the interurban is? Streetcars? Yeah, it was an old electric trolley streetcar that operated between Toledo and Detroit, and also other metro areas in this area. I don't know if it came out to Livonia or not, or Plymouth at this time. It did? It did, yeah. So we have a station right out the window here. Look at that. Oh, there you go. So who knows? There may have been smuggling on that line right there. But anyhow, individuals, what they would do, Michiganders, they would go down to Toledo for a night of drinking, and they figured out, you know what if I put a few bottles in my suit jacket or take a suitcase with me to kind of get it across the border? Eventually, the dry enforcement caught on. They would get on these interurbans, and as soon as they hit the state line, they would bust tens, dozens, sometimes over 100 people at a time, smuggling alcohol on these interurbans. Eventually, these bootleggers had to become more innovative with their smuggling tactics. So this right here is a fake loaf of bread that would unscrew at the top. This is a baby carrier with a fake baby. This is a violin case with a hidden partition. I can show you a few others. They were talked about these fake books existing. I found this on eBay. It's from the time period. Spring Poems, The Four Swallows. There's no birds in this book. There's a button on the side. And there are 4 flasks on the inside, little small ones. Those are the types of books they would have. They talked about fake baby dolls. This was one of the types they would have at that time. This is pretty fragile from the time period there. Another unique thing here, you're probably wondering what this is. So it's a funny story. Women would get on the interurban completely skinny and come back 8 months pregnant all of a sudden, right? And that's because they were holding gallons of alcohol with this contraption around their stomachs. They caught this several times, and they had to hire matron officers just for that purpose. Eventually, though, they kind of get a handle of the interurban traffic, and as you can see by this report here, millions of dollars of alcohol was being confiscated off the interurban. That's how much smuggling was going on. Yeah.
It'd be like 50 or 100 million now.
Well, yeah, you got to do the inflation now. It's probably like 10 million is my guess. Yep. But once they get the interurban traffic figured out, something else happens in the fall of 1918. It is the completion of the only south-north route between Toledo and Detroit called the Dixie Highway. It's completed then. And people are touting it as this huge commercial success connecting the Glass City to the Motor City. For years before that, it was known to be very, very swampy, especially in Monroe County, a lot of farms and things like that. So they paved over the road, and it cuts through Monroe County up to Wayne County. You can see some of the old ruts in the road. Now it's before and after paved. And there's a huge ribbon cutting ceremony. The mayors of Detroit and Toledo, Monroe, go to this because it's such a huge thing. But guess who else is celebrating? The rum runners. And the rum runners own cars, because this is now a direct route between wet Toledo and dry Detroit. And this is going to be a lucrative opportunity for them. And it becomes known as the Avenue des Booze throughout the country. Actually, this roadway is known throughout the country, and we'll see why here in a few slides. But just as the Dixie Highway is opening, there's a huge bust that happens in southeast Michigan, actually just across the border from Ohio. It's that of the Billingsley Gang. The Billingsley Gang was probably the biggest gang prior to national prohibition that operated. They were working out of the state of Washington, which had a state prohibition law. They were operating out of the state of Oklahoma, and I think there was even another state they were working out of. But they came here specifically because they knew this was the most profitable area because of the proximity between Toledo and Detroit and the affordability of cars in this area as well. So what they do in the summer of 1918, they rent out several warehouses in Toledo to store their alcohol. They purchase a fleet of vehicles. They establish commercial ties with Detroit grocery store owners. And every single night, they start trucking it up in the middle of the night. No one's catching them. No one's catching them. And then in September, we know they made $160,000 in pure profit in getting alcohol up to Detroit. The reason we know that, the feds got on them. There was a Fed that went undercover into their group, and they were counting how much money they were making, and they were finally busted. Here's the photograph of that bust with the alcohol lined up alongside the cars. The Billingsley brothers went to jail for actually not as long as I thought they would. Sherman Billingsley, who was the major operator, was 15 months in Leavenworth in Kansas. But he gets out early, and he actually opens up probably the most prominent speakeasy in the country, the Stork Club in New York City, and he runs that for the rest of Prohibition. So what happens after that big bust is the Michigan's governor is like, we have a problem. We got to send our state forces down to the border near Ohio to stop this influx of booze. So the Michigan State Constabulary, which is the predecessor to the Michigan State Police, that's what a lot of those photos are of right there. They go down and they set up random checkpoints. And sure enough, almost every other car that's coming down the Dixie Highway or other roadways are smuggling alcohol. Eventually, the rum runners from Toledo catch on, and they start engaging in shootouts at the border. Farmers are being shot because of the number of shootouts there. Also, a lot of these cars are starting to run through the checkpoints. They just blow through them without concern. So the state constabulary responds in kind. The first thing they try is actually this armored vehicle. It's probably I'm going to argue this. This is probably the first use of an armored vehicle by a police force in the country. This is meant for World War I battlefields, but it was never used, so they brought it to the border. The problem is, if you look closely at this photo, the little flap out the front, little Bertha couldn't see, so it would run into other cars that were not actually meant for stopping. So they had to take it off the roadway. Another incident happens in February 1919. They hear about a convoy of rum runners coming up the roadway, and they set up a checkpoint just south of the city of Monroe. Sure enough, 1 o'clock, this convoy of cars come roaring up the Dixie Highway. They don't stop for the first checkpoint, so they signal up the road about a couple hundred yards. Guess who's waiting with a telephone pole? They plop the telephone pole across the roadway. These rum runners are going 60 miles per hour. Hit the telephone pole. That's the result. I don't know if you can see this. Turned turtle is what they called it. On its hood. Alcohol spews out into the streets. The motorists are injured. Guess what they do? They sue, and successfully. And the governor, I think Governor Green was the governor at that time, tells them never do this again. Never. Yeah. But Oddly enough, just a few weeks later, no one could enforce prohibition in Michigan. And that's because of a Michigan State Supreme Court ruling that invalidated search and seizure for 3 days. So you can imagine what happens, right? Everyone and their brother and mother head down to Toledo, and now they can smuggle alcohol legally into Michigan that supposedly is dry. It's called the booze rush, and this is covered by every single national newspaper. Michigan is known as the laughingstock during these 3 days because of the crazy scenes that are happening in southeast Michigan. So here are some photos from the Toledo News-Bee. Here are just the number of Michigan passengers waiting for the interurban with their suitcases and suit jackets. This is the bumper-to-bumper traffic crossing the Ohio-Michigan line on the Dixie Highway. And it was like this for 3 consecutive days. The officers, all they could do was twiddle their thumbs. You got a question back there? Yeah.
Why was there a 3-day suspension in search and seizure?
So there was a millionaire who lived on an island called Calf Island just south of Grosse Ile. And his property, he argued, was raided illegally, and they confiscated the alcohol from his property. So the Michigan State Supreme Court agreed in his favor, and they invalidated that search and seizure law, and that also affected other personal property, including automobiles. That's the reason why. Then the feds step in, finally. They start to enforce another type of law, and that kind of stops those 3 days. But the damage is already done. Michigan is made out to be a laughingstock. Prohibition has kind of a negative implication. And there are tons of wrecks because people are trying to get alcohol as soon as possible up across the border along Dixie Highway. This is a political cartoon. I forget what newspaper did this. It says Michigan or bust, and all these cars are on the roadway. One of the more humorous stories, a Free Press photographer goes down to the Dixie Highway in Monroe County, near the town of Erie, if you're familiar with it. It's right across the border from Toledo. And he's taking pictures of all these wrecks, and he notices something. That's my car. A rum runner had stolen his car and wrecked his car during this booze rush and left it there. Yeah. Yeah. But just a few months later, really 8 months later, national prohibition begins. But in that time span, before kind of gearing up for national prohibition, what you see is Michigan residents and Canadian residents on both sides of the river gobbling up property. They're gearing up. They know this is going to be a lucrative front for the prohibition trade. It's estimated in the first 7 months of prohibition, this was based on police reports, 900,000 cases of alcohol made its way across the Detroit River in those first 7 months. And like I said, I grew up with the stories about the boats transporting the alcohol from the shore to shore, but one thing I never thought about is the importance of automobiles in moving those loads to that shore and then beyond the next shore. And these photos, these images demonstrate the importance of automobiles during that time period in moving the product, not just the boats, but the cars as well. And remember, like I said, Canada is going to profit off of America's prohibition. Remember, they can export alcohol legally, and they don't care if you have prohibition yourself. They just want to export it for money. One man, the most important man in Michigan, is super upset with how things are going in the early years of prohibition, and that's Henry Ford. He was obviously a huge advocate of prohibition, but he was noticing law enforcement was super lax, especially around his factory gates, and especially among his employees. He still had workers coming to work drunk. What's going on? We have prohibition. So what he starts to do is he institutes the sniff test. He asks his supervisors to smell every single employee who comes in the door. And if they smell like booze, guess what? They're not getting that money anymore. They're fired. And he also hires private investigators to inspect around his factory gates and also really the downriver community. Ecorse, River Rouge, Dearborn. These communities are inspected by his private inspectors, and he sends those reports to the National Prohibition Office. And he's complaining all the time. And sure enough, they respond to Henry Ford, raid after raid, 23, 24, 25. Those years, there are so many raids in this area. And they also send their most prominent undercover agent. His name was Izzy Einstein. That's up here on the right, this guy here sitting down. He had been to New York, New Orleans, I think Chicago, a few other places to inspect kind of what's going on Prohibition-wise. He goes to Detroit as an undercover auto worker to kind of get a sense of the culture. When he's done, he makes this statement. For Prohibition to be ended in the Detroit River area, we need the entire army here. That's how bad it was. And actually, he ends, Izzy Einstein, another kind of a Livonia tie-in here, he hires a local deputy sheriff by the name of Lewis Mitt to help him do his raids, specifically in Hamtramck. He's known as the fighting constable from Livonia because he would get in fights with people at the raids. Yeah. But something important happens in 1925, probably the most important Supreme Court case you've never heard of. It's called Carroll versus United States. So in 1921, this guy, Fred Cronenwett, is a federal agent operating in a highway between Detroit and Grand Rapids. And he sees a car pass his position. He's like, I know that's a rum runner. But he doesn't actually have visual evidence of the booze in the back, but he's seen this car before, he's seen this guy. He decides to pull him over. And sure enough, 60 bottles of scotch and gin in the back seat. But this isn't just any rum runner, this is an intelligent rum runner. His name is George Carroll. And prior to 1925, many individuals who were on the more intelligent side who were rum running would challenge these confiscations in court due to a lack of search warrant. So this case goes through the court system for 4 years and eventually makes its way up, all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court justice at this time is who? Does anyone know? Taft. The former president is now the Supreme Court justice. And he's going to side with the majority decision. I think it's a 7-2 decision. And he says this: motorists should not have to worry about being pulled over for basically any given reason. But if a trained officer with probable cause has a reason to stop and search your vehicle, they can do that. To this day, that still remains in effect. I don't know if you know that. Police officers can search your vehicle for any given reason as long as they have supposed probable cause. And this obviously helps these law enforcement officials who are going to be enforcing against these motorists who are smuggling. And there's just a few pictures, and obviously there was a few pictures in the binder there that show that. I would argue throughout the Prohibition years, the toughest job, without a doubt, was being a law enforcement official. Very often, if they were trying to stop a motor car with alcohol, they'd be greeted with guns, knives. At raids, it wasn't uncommon for them to be greeted with clubs, even mobs of people. This report here, a mob of 500 stormed the police at a raid in Detroit. Can you imagine that as a police officer? And I can attest to a number of police killings during this time period. There was dozens of police officers killed in the Detroit area and beyond. But one local tie-in here was a detective, an 18-year veteran of the city of Detroit police. His name was Daniel Coughlin. He had a wife, 7 kids, and he's responding to a shooting, and it appears to be a gangland shooting in front of a hotel in downtown Detroit. Sure enough, he arrives at the scene, locates the vehicle to the description, gets on the running board of the car, and tries to get them to halt. Sure enough, they shoot him dead blank. They pull him into the vehicle. They drive the car on the outskirts of the city. They abandon the vehicle and take off. No one ever caught these assassins. I think there's some reasonable evidence to point that this was indeed the Purple Gang who was part of the shooting. And actually, his descendants just, I think last year or maybe even this year, had the 100-year memorial mass at St. Michael's in Livonia here for him. So this is a picture of them right here kind of celebrating. And he has a ton of descendants that live in this region. So you can understand why a lot of these officers also became corrupt. They were afraid to enforce the law, and they could also make additional money if they didn't do it as well as they should have. Howard Baker is a good example. He was a border patrol agent, very strict about prohibition earlier in his career, but he actually gets into a car accident chasing a rum runner in a car and becomes crippled for life. A year after that accident, he's found in a conspiracy rum ring with other rum runners, and he gets sent to prison for several years for doing that. But with this new advantage afforded by the Carroll versus United States decision, these rum runners have to be more clever in their concealment in their cars. This is a picture from the Detroit News showing the floorboard that obviously can hide quite a bit of alcohol. Car seats were reupholstered to hold bottles of alcohol. So sometimes cops would have to take knives and cut up the seats. There's a story about a local kind of dairy truck driver from my hometown of Newport, Michigan. And the oral history goes like this. So they had 15 milk canisters they would bring up to Detroit on almost a weekly basis. And there was a state police post that would stop. Oh, my phone is ringing. I'm sorry. Oh, no, it's not mine.
No, that's fine. I'm sorry. I thought I turned it off.
That sounded like my ringtone.
Yeah. Oh, it's spam anyway.
Happens to me. Happens to the best of us. So anyhow, this driver had 15 large milk canisters, and he knew the state police post would routinely check him, but they wouldn't do the very thorough inspection. The outer 10 ring, all milk. The middle 5, all whiskey, up to the Detroit grocery store owner. Also, what you start to see more often in the late Prohibition years after the Carroll versus United States decision, women being caught rum running. And that's because women were not suspected to be engaging in this kind of behavior prior to Prohibition. So this is a good front for a lot of rum runners. So actually a lot of rum runners start to hire women, and they're called rum queens if they are ever caught in the newspapers. The most clever, I think, concealment is actually that of hearses. There were actually funeral homes that were smuggling alcohol in the Detroit metro area. This specific article is talking about, I think it was technically around the Corktown area, Delray area. And an officer sees this convoy of cars following a hearse, and he's thinking to himself, okay, there's not a church nearby. They're not going in the direction of a cemetery. They're coming away from the river. What's going on? So he goes to the convoy, and he starts creeping up, and sure enough, everyone ditches their vehicle. Alcohol in every single car. They open up the coffin, 2,400 bottles of beer in the coffin. Yeah. And I had shared that story at another talk. I forget where it was, and sure enough, someone had admitted that's what they did. Their family had did that also on the east side of Detroit. And remember, at the beginning of Prohibition, one of the arguments for it would erase the issue of drunk driving. But I can tell you, drunk driving remained an issue and perhaps increased during the Prohibition years. There's not a lot of stats on this, but I found this chart. This is Toledo, 1925. That's showing you that at least one person every day is being arrested for drunk driving in the city of Toledo. And if you look at the other kind of newspaper reports, certainly drunk driving is still a menace throughout, and people are being killed. Gertrude Cousineau, this girl right here, was from Erie, Michigan. This is in 1919, during the state Prohibition years. She's waiting for the interurban to take her to her job in Toledo. So she's waiting for this trolley, and all of a sudden a drunken rum runner comes up the roadway on Dixie Highway, smashes into her, instantly kills her. He gets 10 years manslaughter. Another incident happens, if you're familiar with Henry Ford Wyandotte Hospital, right at that intersection. A drunken rum runner once again runs into an intersection, kills a Catholic school nun and an African-American construction laborer who was just working in the site. But this story is more of a local story. This is apparently, I was talking with people before about this. Does anyone know anything about this old Hawthorne golf course? Anyone heard about this? It was in the area apparently. It's closed. Was that? Yeah, they're saying it's near Ford Road. And anyhow, it was in the late 1920s, I think it was 29, a Plymouth man by the name of Royal Martin was driving to his home, and he saw another motorist was stuck off the roadway. He was giving him a push. So while he's giving that car a push, a drunk driver from Detroit is roaring up the roadway, smashes into the back of his car, pins him against the car in front of him. The car ignites, catches on fire, and he burns to death. So it's stories like this, like, you know, people are wondering, is Prohibition even effective if we're having incidents like this happening? And one of the reasons why I think actually drunk driving was increasing is because of the proliferation of what are called roadhouses. So roadhouses were kind of somewhat of a new thing at this time, but essentially these were illegal bars during the Prohibition years that would operate on the outskirts of town away from police supervision. So these were a constant place of partying, and therefore people would have to drive pretty considerable distances to get to these places and therefore back home drunk. And then another very important thing happens in 1927 that really changes the Prohibition landscape, and that's the repeal of the OTA and the replacement with the Liquor Control Act. So the Liquor Control Act basically allows the Canadian government to sell directly to civilians now, including American tourists. So what you start to see after the year 1927 is more Americans are cutting out that middleman, that bootlegger, and going over to Canada themselves to drink. And just a few years later, guess what opens? The Ambassador Bridge. So this also helps the flow of thirsty Detroiters and thirsty Michiganders, and really people from all over the area. Hundreds of thousands of people are crossing the bridge to drink in Canada at this time. And I would argue the direct result of that, because they're cutting out the middleman, is there are less customers for the gangsters, and it leads up to all-out war in the region. So in my hometown, the summer of 1927, immediately after that starts, 4 bodies show up. And that never happened prior to that point. 4 bodies of rum runners show up in the city and in the outskirts of the city. In Toledo, what would happen, especially after 1927, is that gangsters, when they would commit a killing or a hit, they would dump the body across the border in Michigan because they didn't want the Toledo police to deal with it because they were sometimes in cahoots with them. So they would dump the bodies. One story I can share that I can think of off the top of my head, Charles Ebner was his name. He was a used car dealer in Point Place, Ohio, right across the border. And apparently he did something wrong. He had been, I guess, selling cars to rum runners. They abduct him. They shoot him in the car. They dump his body across the border. But the rum runners, they come back to the house, and his 2 sons are home. The 2 sons wake up. The rum runners tell the boy, go across the street and fetch the newspaper. And sure enough, they're making him read about his dad's death. Yeah, that's how awful it was. Another kind of demonstrating the Toledo gangland culture, there was another guy who was essentially a rum runner from Cleveland who was kind of nudging in on the territory. They quartered him, and they spread his body parts all around the border. Yeah. But probably the most gruesome gang, as you probably know, is the Purple Gang. But one thing that many people get wrong about the Purple Gang, it was actually a loose confederation of gangs. There was kind of a core group, and then there was other kind of smaller gangs that attached themselves to that core group. One of those kind of loose groups was called the Little Jewish Navy, and they were infamous for hijacking loads of alcohol coming across from Canada. They would hijack boats. And that's why Canada started to employ police kind of escort for some of these services. But anyhow, they started to do less business after 1927, so they started moving down to Toledo and hijacking loads there. Well, guess what? They hijack a load of one of the core Purple Gang members. This is going to cause a problem for them. So they decide to set up a meeting in Detroit at the Collingwood Manor Apartments. And so they have this meeting in these apartments. Everything seems to be going well And all of a sudden, someone hits the horn in the alleyway. That's the signal for the guys to pull out their machine guns and kill every member of the little Jewish Navy in that apartment. They escape in the car. Eventually, they are caught, arrested, and served in the Marquette State Prison. But that's just an indicator of the Purple Gang's ruthlessness. There was a lot of other things I could share there, but there's not enough time. And you got to think, as a police officer operating in this kind of landscape, you have to become more aggressive, or you're probably going to die. There's a lot of pressure to kind of enforce the law more rigorously because of these criminals, right? So Henry Ford is advocating, and many others are actually advocating for this, shotgun enforcement. Essentially, shoot first, ask questions later. And this results in some really bad situations. So for instance, I don't know if you've been following that Swan Boat Club incident down in Newport. So right there used to be, sometimes the state police would hang out there for rum runners who were coming across the lake. So a state police division was waiting for boats that were coming across, and actually that day the water was frozen, so cars were coming across. He shoots the lead car, kills the driver. There's no alcohol in that car. But nothing ever happens to that police officer. Another incident happens. It was a Wyandotte teenager who was actually rum running with a car. And he's just, where is it? I think it's in River Rouge, right there at the Rouge River there. He abandons his vehicle, is running away, and there's alcohol in his car. The officers shoot him in the back. So there's plenty of controversial incidents that are starting to happen, not just in the Detroit metro area, but also throughout the country. So you start to see people driving with banners like this, or this license plate repealed the 18th Amendment. Prohibition is becoming very, very unpopular. This is a political cartoon showing a family grieving over the loss of their father, who all these officers are like, well, we thought he had alcohol, we had to shoot, that kind of thing. Actually, I found this in the, I've never seen this photo before. This is actually in the Plymouth Mail. I've been doing research in the Plymouth Mail for some local events, and that image shows how there was a debate about whether officers should have to have some kind of indicator that they were a police officer. So they finally did that in the late Prohibition years. It says, stop U.S. Official of Prohibition. So there was a debate about, obviously, these individuals who were enforcing the law. And as the public starts to turn against Prohibition, so do the automobile tycoons. So Alfred Sloan is the first automobile tycoon who starts to change lanes on this issue. He's the head of GM. Before this, he was a prominent voice. He was actually advocating for the Anti-Saloon League, but he becomes a crusader, which is basically for the repeal of Prohibition because of the Valentine's Day Massacre. He's just flabbergasted at that murder. He's like, anything that produces that kind of violence, I'm against. John Willies also changes lanes because of the economic issues. Toledo is gripped by the Great Depression, just like Detroit, and he's arguing if we repeal Prohibition and start collecting taxes on alcohol, our economy will be in a better position. The same is true of Harvey Firestone, the tire maker and really good friend of Henry Ford. So it was shocking when he actually came out in favor of repeal. But probably the biggest voice and the most important voice against Prohibition in the late Prohibition years was this guy, Henry Joy. He was the head of Packard Motors at this time. And he was actually a big-time speaker for the Anti-Saloon League. He was one of the most prominent speakers. He would travel the country talking in favor of Prohibition. But he has property on St. Clair Shores. And his property kind of becomes a battleground between rum runners and law enforcement officials. So sure enough, bullets are flying and hitting some of his boathouses. People are being arrested on his property, and this is happening week after week, month after month. He's like, when is this going to stop? And he's just arguing before, actually, he goes to U.S. Congress eventually. He says, Prohibition just creates more criminals, so we have to get rid of this. And eventually, even Henry Ford gives in, after the repeal of Prohibition, that is. There's a company luncheon which I think he's showcasing a new car, and sure enough, he serves beer there, right? Even though he's very much against alcohol to that point. So, I don't know if you know this, Michigan was the first state to ratify the 21st Amendment because we were very much in favor of repealing Prohibition, and we loved alcohol, obviously. Does anyone know the first place to have alcohol when Prohibition was repealed here in Michigan? Specific location? Belle Isle. Belle Isle had the first delivery on December 4th, 1955. There's some interesting pictures from that. But, as I kind of wrap up this presentation, historians have argued for many reasons why the noble experiment Prohibition fails. They point to rampant crime, corrupt law enforcement, even the Great Depression. But I'd argue you have to consider the automobile as well and the motor car craze. If Prohibition would have started just 20 years earlier, maybe in 1900, how would that have looked different, right? The interurbans set schedules to do busts on, plotting horses, like you can bust those guys easily, right? But with an automobile, you have a lot more freedom as a criminal to move this product much quicker. And that happens not just in our region, but across the country. So I'd argue to some extent, the automobile was responsible for taking Prohibition to its death ride and never to return. And most people would argue that's a good thing. So, and with that, I just wanted to show you a few of the Livonia kind of area stuff I've kind of caught. So this is actually the Justice of Peace beaten up by that Lewis Smith guy, the fighting constable from Livonia. He beat up politicians who were against him, and also people he would raid. There was apparently a local pilot from Plymouth who was smuggling alcohol from Windsor by airplane. This specific one from 1931, this guy, his name is Leno Dennis from Livonia Township. Unfortunately, this article blocks out how many pints of alcohol, but it's a significant amount. Probably hundreds, it looks like. There were police busts of certain cars that were being abandoned in the Plymouth area that were full of alcohol. There's that article I referred to earlier. This is kind of an interesting one. There was reports, like I said, of chicken thieves in the area. And sure enough, they descend upon this farm on I think it was the west side of Plymouth. And sure enough, they found a speakeasy in that house. It was owned by, where was the name of that person? Yes, where's it at right here? Sheldon Gale. Yep, Sheldon Gale. So I don't know if anyone knows that name or that last name, but they apparently had a speakeasy in the area. And then these are articles talking about the police chief in Plymouth really cracking down the law. But someone actually accused Plymouth's police chief of smuggling himself, and they were sued by that police chief. So, yeah. So with that, any questions? Yeah.
I have a comment. It's funny, and I'm sure you probably hear this from people. They say, "Oh, things are so violent today," and you think, "Excuse me, things haven't changed much."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would argue, and obviously the 1920s are kind of a fun period, a fun time to talk about. But they were some of the most brutal years of being an American, where crime was in the face of people. And also to think about, once again, I talk about in the book, the advent of the automobile and traffic rules, people were being mowed down by cars all the time because there was competition between pedestrians and cars for the roadways. So not just violent crime, but violent deaths in front of them all the time because of cars. Yeah.
Was the Purple Gang only Detroit or nationwide? Or more regional?
So it's more regional. Because some of their individuals go down to Toledo. Actually, Yanni Licavoli is kind of one of those loose Confederate Purple Gang members, and he's probably one of the most brutal people. He used to operate in Detroit, but he moves to Toledo after his brother is put in prison for smuggling on the east side of Detroit. And one thing to remember, too, here is the Purple Gang is heavily associated with Al Capone. There's a lot of evidence that points to the fact the Valentine's Day Massacre was actually committed by Purple Gang members. And actually, I can't think of the guy's name right now off the top. There's one guy we do know that was definitely there because they've run the ballistics on the gun, and that gun is in Berrien County in the police department. So that guy was definitely there. He went to prison for the rest of his life. Yeah.
I just have a question. So all the alcohol that was transported was manufactured by an alcohol company that manufactures alcohol?
That's a good point. So Depends on who's buying the alcohol, who's the customer. So if this is Al Capone wants the high-quality liquor coming from Canada directly, no cutting. He might cut it himself there if he has certain kinds of customers. But let's say if this alcohol is going to a rural farmer, people along the border, and even sometimes in communities like this, farming communities, if it's on the way, they would cut that alcohol with their own moonshine to sell it at a cheaper price. Yep.
So during national prohibition, was no alcohol manufactured in the United States?
No, you can, well,
Or
man,
was it
I
manufactured,
should,
they just couldn't sell it to?
correct. Yeah, you could manufacture, you could make your own stuff. Actually, Napa, Napa Valley, they get their start during Prohibition by selling like bricks of wine that you make at home. Yeah, so they say, don't let this sit out for longer, hint, hint, right? And it turns into wine. Yeah.
Did you say what year the prohibition
Ends.
ends? Yeah.
So it goes from 1918 in Michigan, it starts, and it ends in 1933. So 15 years. 15 years of Prohibition in Michigan. Yep.
But some people are making bathtub gin, so you have people at home competing with the gangster element. So they must have made a lot of money during that time.
They did. They did. And if you didn't do things right, there were reports in the east end of Monroe, there were some people that were shot and killed right off their porch because they weren't doing something right with the gin that they were making. So you want to do things right, that's for sure, if you have a certain supplier. Any other questions?
Who came up with the idea for the prohibition?
Who came? Well, yeah. Well, once again, it stems from this. There's no doubt that alcoholism was a problem prior to 1918. If you look at the alcohol rates, actually, Prohibition, by that measure, is successful. It destroys alcoholism for like an entire generation. It's not until the 1970s and 80s does it start to rebound to the pre-Prohibition levels. So for a whole generation, Prohibition was successful in regards to eliminating or at least reducing alcoholism. And many people were dying definitely prior to Prohibition from alcoholism. Good point. Any other questions? Yeah.
What do you got on Belle Isle?
Oh, man. Belle Isle was run by a corrupt officer who was living there. There are huge investigations in the late 20s regarding basically the officers looking the other way as rum runners are using that as kind of a launching off point between, obviously, it's Walkersville, I think is across from there, and Windsor to some extent, and obviously Detroit. Yeah, actually, Yanni Iacovoli and his brother Pete Iacovoli were big in that area of things. But massive amounts of rum running, for sure, in the late 1920s at least. Alrighty. And I don't know, I think I showed you guys pretty much everything. This is kind of a cool thing to show. This is an aerial photo of the rum running across the ice between Canada and Trenton, downriver. So when the ice actually used to freeze over, right? They said, you could be at that time an airplane and see dozens of cars crossing the ice at that point. All right, so with that, I want to say thank you for having me tonight. I'll be up here selling the book for $20 if you'd like to purchase some, and thank you again for having me. Thank you.